Okay, sorry about that. We had to reset. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, the internet here has been really wonky where there are just constant disconnects on the OBS side. So I don't know why that's happening, but it is. And so we have to use a VPN. And so I had forgot to set the VPN and it disconnected almost immediately. So now we are on the VPN and we should have no problems keeping this going in the future. So excellent. Okay, so anyway, today we're going to be talking about games specifically, but we can talk about other media as well, and basically what happens when people readapt it, and why does that offend people a lot of the times. I myself am a victim of this as well. I'm not happy when they adapt some of my favorite things. For instance, when Final Fantasy VII Remake first came out, I was super thrilled, and then what we got was not what they promised. I'll get into that a little bit later. Not thrilled with the Cowboy Bebop redo. That's another one for me. But yeah, but then there are remakes that are, or even adaptations to movies and whatnot that are done fairly well. And again, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a perfect example of this because it's not a remake at all. And that was, so maybe that's a good place to start. So with Final Fantasy VII Remake, it was kind of funny because for a lot of us who enjoyed Final Fantasy VII back in 1997, this game obviously it was the first 3D Final Fantasy. This was a big leap from the previous generation where we had the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, and then you move into these 3D graphics on the PlayStation. And they hadn't been fully realized yet. If you look at Final Fantasy VIII or Final Fantasy IX, they look a lot better, even though they're using basically the same graphics engine. Final Fantasy VII had this weird, blocky Popeye arm looking thing and going on, and yeah, it just looked really bizarre. But at the time, I mean, it was new, it was fresh, so it was acceptable. But obviously, it did not age well, and I mean, it did not. It aged worse than even previous titles that were only 16 bits. So the fact that when a lot of people wanted it to get a remake where you could see it in modern graphics, so that could be updated because that was pretty much the biggest flaw in the game in a lot of people's minds. And when they announced that they were going to do that, a lot of people got excited because they're like, "Oh yay, we can finally play this game, the way it was meant to be played, the way it was meant to be experienced." And so that was a really big point of excitement. And then the game comes out, and they said they were going to change some things. And for the most part, I think people were pretty accepting of a lot of the changes. The idea that they were going to be expanding on the story, they're only doing Midgar, that made people a little, some people wanted the full story, but at least they could kind of flesh out, some more things. And things like, I think it's chapter 4, I think, the one where you go visit Jesse's home. Those parts of the game were accepted, I think, pretty universally because they expanded on the story. They didn't change anything. They just expanded it and gave you more. So people really liked that. But then, of course, with the whole was Arbiters of Fate or whatever, they went through, they changed the story dramatically. And that's one of the things that's kind of funny because they sold it as a remake. They got a lot of people on board with it because people thought it was going to be a remake, and it ended up not staying true to the original story. A lot of people were not happy, and then it turns out that it's actually not a remake at all. It's a sequel. So now it's funny because if you look at people that are looking at it as a straight remake, they don't like it. If you look at people that are looking at it as a sequel, they do like it. And me personally, I do like it. I did enjoy the game. I thought it was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to the next one. But looking at it as a remake, I am very disappointed. But looking at it as a sequel, I am enjoying it very much. And so why is that? That's kind of a strange phenomenon, and I'm obviously not the only person that feels that way. A lot of people feel this way about a lot of things. I felt similarly about Cowboy Bebop. Why are they changing these characters' personalities? Then maybe they're sticking relatively close to the plot, at least early on, but then later on, they dramatically change motivations of characters. They dramatically change. And you always hear you can always go back and watch the original, or you can always go back and play the original. So For a lot of people, some people accept it and other people don't. So what's going on there? Why are we acting this way around these things? Why do people hold their games so, you know, sacred, basically? And I mean, to me, it actually makes a lot of sense. It's very logical. I mean, we even call it canon, right? And canon is a religious term, basically meaning this is the story as we accept that it happened. This is the true story, right? And it's kind of like with Star Wars, where you had the extended universe, and originally the extended universe was canon, and then they changed it and they said this is not canon anymore. These are like imagined stories. We're completely redoing the canon. And a lot of Star Wars fans were not happy with that because it means that we're losing out on things. So part of it, I think, is just this, the general sense of ownership, right? This is something that we enjoyed. It's something that's very important to us. It's a narrative that shapes who we are when, from our youth or even when we're older. But this is something that we internalize. And so in a way, it's almost like a religion, or personal philosophies or that sort of thing. So when somebody comes out and changes it, that, I think psychologically we react to it very similarly to the way we would react to, say, heresy. Somebody is going against our teaching, somebody is going against our beliefs, and they are bastardizing it. They're changing it. They're doing it incorrectly or teaching the wrong things in our name, right? And I think that is why people get so defensive of it. I think it's just a natural part of human psychology. We latch on to things, and they become very important to us. And when somebody comes along and says, no, that's wrong, we get really defensive about it. So I think that's part of it. And I think part of it, too, is, so let's take, for example, Cowboy Bebop, the show, right? So for some people who watch the original, that is the story of Cowboy Bebop. And if they're going to be discussing it, they're going to be discussing it in the context of that story. So, if they're talking about some of maybe the philosophical things that they maybe come up throughout the show, or they're talking about, events that occur, then, they're like, okay, this is what happens here. This is what this means. This is what this represents. But when you introduce a remake, for instance, like the live show, if you keep it true to the original, everybody's kind of on the same page, right? So everyone's saying, like, this is what happens, this is what this means, this is the story. But when you start changing characters and you start changing parts of the story and you start changing motivations, then you actually kind of create two different schools. So that's kind of like a schism in, a church, basically, where you have people who believe in one thing, and now you have people who come in with this new one. And it's not in the same sense of like, I think that there needs to be reform, and so I'm changing it. It's more of that you have people that came in with the original. That's the story to them. You have people who come in with the new one, especially younger people when they're introducing, because a lot of times they're trying to introduce the fan base to a new generation. That's kind of the motivation for doing a lot of these remakes and reboots and whatnot. Or not necessarily a different generation, but a different group of people, right? If you have Monster Hunter the game and they decide to make it a movie, they're not making it to appeal to the gamers, most likely. They're using it to broaden the scope of what the people, they're introducing it into a new group, basically, and they're trying to kind of convert those people into this broader thing, right? They're trying to convert them into the cult of Monster Hunter, or whatever you want to call it. And of course, when these two groups come together, and the first group is like, oh yeah, this is great and that's great and this is good, and the second group comes along and they're like, well, no, that's not right. That never happens. That's not how it works, right? For example, if you were playing the original Monster Hunter games and you say like, oh, okay, these people and they have the monsters, they do this, that, and the other one, and then you have somebody come along and they're like, what are you talking about? It's a different world. There's a different dimension. People can travel between them. What if monsters jumped into our world? And to somebody that played the original games, it's like, that's ridiculous. That there's nothing in it that would indicate that that's even a possibility. Why would you even suggest this? But then of course the second person is like, because that's the story, right? And so of course that's where you get people getting defensive because, for one person, this is the story, and for the other person, this is the story. And I think for a lot of times, that's why personally, for me, if you're gonna reimagine something, I would personally prefer to just do, and rather than saying based on, I would rather say inspired by. That's just my personal preference, right? Um, for example, I've been listening to podcasts about Stephen King recently, and they often talk about how you have his books and they adapt them for the screen, right? And of course, obviously, when you're adapting a book to the screen, you have to make changes. There's just time constraints that you cannot do things in a book that you cannot do things in a movie that you can do in the book. Also, a book is more interpretive, whereas a movie is much more literal. So there are things that you can get away with in a book that you cannot get away with in a movie, right? If you say like there's this, like if you're talking about like a kind of a fear, like a dread that's overtaking, this the characters emotionally, you don't get the same sense of, you get, it might seem like a person's psychotic on the screen because you personally can't see anything and you can't see their internal dialogue. So you can just see the expressions on their face. And so because of that, some things don't adapt well. So, but in general, we do accept movies, but I think what that is, and I think this is the case with a lot of things. Okay, so for example, I enjoyed the show Game of Thrones, right? I thought it was great, at least the first few seasons, especially. But here's the thing. I never read the book, right? So I don't have that basis. So for me, I'm part of that, the new schism of Game of Thrones. And for people that had read the books, I'm sure a lot of them were not happy with the show because, again, they have this story and the people who are watching the show are not getting the story. And then when that fandom comes in, they compete, and they compete as, who are the biggest fans, right? And then that's what people do. We compete. We're natural competitors, right? So we are going in there with the what do you call it? We're going in there with this idea of, oh, I'm a huge fan. I love this stuff. This stuff is great. And then we start talking about, all these things we love. And the other group is like, that never happened. If you were a true fan, you would know the true story. You're getting this, this kind of different version of the story and whatnot. And yeah, that I think that's just a very human psychological thing. I mean, okay, this might be a bit controversial to say, but I'm not saying it's the exact same thing, but I'm saying psychologically it probably comes from a very similar place. But in a way, gaming and these books and stuff, they are a form of culture, right? They are their own culture. The fan culture, gaming culture, right? So when you, as a fan, have a story that you really enjoy, and that is part of the culture, everybody in your culture agrees on what this means, agrees on what it is, because they all have the same experience or they all have the same point of reference. And then that gets adapted into a different culture, the movie culture or whatever. And that creates basically a new form of it or a new interpretation of it. I think people inherently react on a psychological level in a similar way that they would react to something like cultural appropriation, right? So if you have a group of people who maybe have certain forms of dress or something like that, it's part of their culture. It's something that's very important to them because it defines them as a group. And then when another group comes along and takes those motifs or those ideas and adapts them in their own way that is new and to the original group feels disrespectful because they just think it's cool or whatever, the original group gets offended, right? Because to them that is, you're not taking it as seriously because you don't understand it. You're getting this filtered view of it that's not the true original form. And I think in games and stuff like that, it's a very similar phenomenon psychologically. where, we're all on board with this. We're all experiencing the same thing. Here's a new version of it. And then when people are accepting of that, it feels like we've been marginalized. It feels like, hey, we've been loving this thing for the whole time. And now you're changing it. You're adapting it to suit the needs of other people, not suit the needs of the people that are already in this gaming culture or this movie culture or this book culture, right? And so I think psychologically it makes a lot of sense that people react that way. So I think when you say something like, well, the original still exists, you can go back and play the original. I do think that, it is reasonable that people get offended by that, in the sense that, it's not like, oh, you guys are just idiots, whatever, who cares, like you're being overly sensitive. No, personally, I think that I think there's a legitimate psychological reason for people to react the way they do, and and so I do think. Now, I'm not, like I said, I'm not saying that this is the exact same thing. I am saying that these are different. This is not something. A lot of these games don't exist for thousands of years and define daily lives of most people. But I think on a psychological level, it's getting into our brain the same way, and our brains are accepting it the same way. And when somebody wants to go along and change that, I think our brains are reacting to it in the same way. So yeah, so I think that it's a lot more complicated than a lot of times it gets treated, because I think on the one hand you do have the people who are the original fans and who do react very vehemently, and they do get violent, which, again, if you're looking at any group of people, like certain religions or whatever, where people go against their teachings, they get violent, and so and or they get combative about it. So I do think that this is a very human reaction to it. So and I think a lot of times when you say something like the original still exists, of course people are going to get angry at that. Saying that they're being childish, I don't think is entirely fair, because yeah, I think it's just a natural human reaction to something that is very important to us, that we've had in our lives for a relatively long time. I mean, Final Fantasy VII came out, they just had their 25th anniversary. I'm 38 years old. That's over half of my lifetime. So I've lived over half of my life with this game being a very big part of it. I played Final Fantasy 6. It was Final Fantasy 3 at the time on the Super Nintendo. I played it at my friend's house. I didn't have a Nintendo. I had a Sega Genesis. And so mostly what I had played through the Genesis era were platformers. Sonic the Hedgehog. We also played Fantasia. We had a few games like Bonanza Brothers that were a little bit different and whatnot. But mostly it was, stuff like Sonic the Hedgehog was mostly what I was playing. Vector Man, that sort of thing. So those were mostly what I was playing, were these platformers. And there were RPGs on the Sega Genesis. There was Phantasy Star. But got somebody in the chat here. Yo, how you doing? Nice to see you joining our show today. All right, I believe this is one, I always confuse. This one should be Steven, or is this one Kevin? I always get confused. This one's Steven, right? But yeah, so I never really played RPGs except at friends' houses, and I've played them off and on. I played Secret of Mana, played Secret of Evermore, played Final Fantasy 3, which was actually Final Fantasy 6. So we played, those over at his house, but not on my own, not on a hardcore level, right? And then when the PlayStation came out, I remember seeing the advertisements for Final Fantasy 7, and I was thinking I enjoyed playing Final Fantasy 6 at my friend's house. But again, that's off and on. It's like, maybe once a week or something we go over there and we play through it, and I'll get, maybe 80% of the story, but some of the stuff, he does on his own sometimes, and I miss out on it or whatever. So plus the way that we were playing, this was back in the day where you could rent video games. They had video game rentals. So they would go and, you would go to the rental store, rent the game, play it. It had saves on the disc itself. So, when you returned it, you kind of had to hope that somebody else Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, we didn't have class yesterday. Oh no, nobody told you because we had the finals. So we have a comment here. It is one of my students in there talking about how they showed up to school yesterday, um, when class was canceled because they have finals, and so apparently their mom told them that they needed to go to go to our school, and they did, but we didn't have class, so that must have been awkward. But yeah, so you kind of had to hope that nobody had rented this the game while you were, over the course of the week, so that you could get it the next week. And then you had to also hope that nobody had saved over your saves because everybody was, I think the game had 3 save slots. So you kind of had to hope that nobody else was saving over your saves. And that was kind of hit or miss. So typically, I didn't live in a big town. So typically we could get away with it and it would be pretty okay. But every now and then, your save disappears, right? Because, if you do have 4 people, one person rents it, all 3 save slots are taken up. You gotta pick one to delete, right? So then they do end up deleting one, and sometimes that one's yours, and it just works out that way. So, we got through it, but it was kind of half-hearted. Final Fantasy VII was the first RPG that I played straight through, and it was the first RPG that I played on my own, entirely independently. So it does hold a special place in my heart. And it is, I would say probably Final Fantasy VI is what really introduced me to RPGs, but then Final Fantasy VII is probably what really solidified it for me, because even back then, I was still playing mostly on the PlayStation. I didn't really have so many platformers. They did have a few, they had Croc and a few others, but mostly I was playing either racing games. I was playing Jet Moto, Rage Racer, was it GTA 3 wasn't out yet, but I was playing racing games, or I was playing some puzzle games like Intelligence Cube or something like that, you know. And then when I got Final Fantasy 7 after that, then I got really into RPGs, and then I started playing, a lot of them, was it Thousand Arms, Dragoon, Lunar, those sort of things. So that's when I really started getting into RPGs, was in the PlayStation era, and that was immediately after playing Final Fantasy VII. So of course this is very important to me. So if they're going to change it, of course that's going to be slightly offensive to me, because it's kind of like, oh, I had this great experience, I loved it, and then when they say they're going to readapt it, or they're going to remake it, and they're going to give it to a new generation, it's like, oh, that's great, other people can experience the things I experienced, and they can see them, and you get excited about it, and you want to see all those old characters again, and you want to see them in new graphics, and then they change the story. Okay. And now it's like, okay, the new generation is talking about this. That's not my experience. And so, of course, you get defensive about it. So I totally understand why people get that way. Now, that's not to say that it's always bad. Now, I think in Final Fantasy VII Remake's case specifically, I think that was a little bit devious in the way they did it, because they did basically come out and say Final Fantasy VII Remake. So at that time, remake, at least to my understanding, and I think a lot of other people's understanding, versus a remaster. A remaster was basically when you took the old games and maybe gave it a few higher resolution, gave it better textures. Basically, you didn't rebuild the game from the game up. You just kind of took the old source code and maybe cleaned it up a bit, right? So you said, okay, if we had this game that was originally in this resolution, we're upping it up to a higher resolution. So you're going to lose some of those jagged lines on polygons. We're going to add new textures. Okay, that was a remaster for a lot of people. Whereas a remake was when you created the game, but you updated you put it in a new engine. So something like, say, the best example that I can think is on the PS3, they did the Shadow of the Colossus remaster, where they took the PS2 Shadow of the Colossus, upped the resolution, made it so it could run at higher resolution, and updated the textures. But it was still the same game under the hood. They just basically gave it a new coat of paint. They didn't rebuild it, right? So that was a remaster. And then on the PS4, Bluepoint did a remake of Shadow of the Colossus, where they basically built the game again from the ground up, but they didn't change anything. It's essentially the exact same game. It's just better graphics. And some of the mechanics they even updated. So that and one thing that they did that was really cool was they had classic controls, because the first game was, the original game was kind of wonky to control. It didn't control the best. So they had classic controls, but they also had modern controls that made it play more, or made the controls more in line with what modern games are doing. So so for instance, jump would be on the same button that it would be, I think X or something like that, or the grapple button or the attack buttons. They made it a little less drifty in some of the controls. So they made it feel like a modern game, but it was still the original game. And that's what I think a lot of people understood a remaster to be, was basically take the old game, build it from the ground up, don't change any of the story or anything like that, but fix some of the issues that the original engine might have had. And so yeah, I remember they were advertising the Bluepoint Shadow of the Colossus as a remake, and when Final Fantasy VII Remake was being advertised, I think that's what a lot of people had in their minds. Maybe adding a few things to fill in some of the gaps, but not changing the core game itself. And then they said it's going to be action-oriented combat as opposed to real time. And a lot of people didn't like that. I didn't like the fact that they were changing that. I really was kind of sad that they were changing that. It was fun, yeah, but I would have been happy if they had not changed it too. I'll be entirely honest. I would have been totally cool with that. And at the time, I would have been more cool with it. Now, having played it, it's fun, so I accept it. But yeah, so that's what a lot of people were expecting, and then they completely changed not just parts of the story, but the kind of the overall philosophy of the story, the overall, the concepts of the story are undermined by this new thing, and I think a lot of people took a lot of offense to that. And here's the thing: if they had not introduced it as Final Fantasy Remake, if they hadn't, if the first one had been Final Fantasy Rebirth, I think people would have been a little more accepting of it, because then they would have gone in with the mindset that this is a sequel. This is, we're continuing the story, but rehashing some of the old beats, and then but twisting them and taking them in a new direction. People would have been still angry because they wanted to remake, and they weren't getting it, so they still would have been mad about that. But I think overall there would have been less backlash against it. But now that it's very solidly a sequel, and Square Enix seems to be accepting of that, and open about it. Now that they're more open about, yeah, this is not a remake, this is a sequel, I think people are a lot more accepting of it than they were when it first came out, because you're adding to the canon, you're not changing the canon. And I think people that's kind of the distinction there. Changing canon makes people mad. Adding to the canon makes people happy, right? And I think that's part of the thing with the Halo show, right? When they were like, "Oh, okay, this is a different universe. This is the silver timeline, not the original," And I think that for a lot of people, that kind of felt like a cop out. Marvel gets away with it because comics have been doing multiverses for I don't even know how many years, probably longer than I've been alive, is how long they've been doing that. And comic book characters get readapted all the time, right? So because of that, I think people have kind of become used to it. I'm sure when it first happened, a lot of people weren't very happy, but at this point, we've come such a long way that I think now it's kind of like, oh yeah, of course they have multiverses, and these things get redone all the time. So I think people are just more accepting of it in general. Same with like fairy tales, right? We have, how many versions of classic fairy tales do we have? We have tons of them, and nobody gets offended when it doesn't follow the original, at least not too much. I mean, some people kind of get, superficially, some people do get offended. I say superficially, but that's actually me being hypocritical, because I've just gone on this whole rant about how these people are perfectly justified in their beliefs. So some people do get offended, but I think overall culturally we've accepted these are really old stories. They've been adapted 100 times. So people putting their own little twists and turns into them. That's just something that happens. That's part of. I think people just have, in general, come to accept that as the norm. So I think it's a slightly different situation, but not entirely different. But yeah, so sometimes though these things can be successful. And I don't just mean successful in the sense that I didn't like the new Cowboy Bebop, the ideas that they're going with, but a lot of people did. On the regular show, Antoine really enjoyed it. He loves it. I do not, and so there's so there are people that are from the old fandom that do enjoy these modern adaptations, and maybe they're just more open minded. That's a possibility, and maybe Antoine's more open minded than I am. That's a possibility. Or maybe they just it fits a style that they enjoy, right? There have definitely been times where I'll see the original and then they change it up. Like for instance, with say Final Fantasy VII, I was disappointed that they were not doing active time combat or active time battle, but I enjoyed the new gameplay, so I was like, okay, this is fun. I accept it now. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that are still like, no, this is not good. It should have been the original, the active time battle. And I'm sure there's still people that are feel that way. And I'm not going to say that I'm more open-minded than them. Maybe it's just I enjoy, like if I look at a lot of the games that I play now, Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon Forbidden West, a lot of the games that I play now are action-oriented games. So, that's something that I enjoy. Some people don't enjoy action-oriented games. They don't, they like that kind of slower pacing of battle. So that might just be a preference thing. That this fits into something that I already like, so I'm like, okay, I'll accept it. That's definitely a possibility there as well. Can't say, but yeah, but overall, I think there are ways to do these kind of reboots and whatnot correctly. So for example, back to the Halo thing, they're changing the storyline, they're recreating the story, and people can say, oh, you can go back and play the original games. But I think on some level, it's not even just an I'm offended kind of thing. I think on some level, it's a I'm disappointed thing, and that makes me angry. People who played the original Halo games, they love it. The story is very important to them. The characters are very important to them. They want that to succeed. They don't want it to fail. And the reason they want it to succeed and they want it to be accurate is because they want to share their passion with other people. And when it gets twisted or changed, they feel like they can't share their thing because their thing is not what's being presented to this new group. And of course, then they get angry at the person who did it because then it comes across as fan fiction, right? It's like, this is not the story. This is you doing what you want to do and just completely ignoring the rest of the fan base. We don't necessarily have, a huge budget or the backing of Paramount Plus to put together our vision of what we want. You do, and the fact that you can go out there and change it without consulting the rest of the group, in a way. That does make people angry. I totally understand that there. All right, drinking coffee. But yeah, so I totally 100% understand that. Whereas something like Horizon, I think it's 2047. I think that's the name. I know it's Horizon in the date, but something like that, they're saying, okay, we have the story of Horizon, Horizon Zero Dawn, Horizon Forbidden West. Soon we're going to get Horizon Call of the Mountain, which is going to follow an entirely new character. So it's going to exist in the same world, but it's going, I think you're a member of the Karja, if I understand correctly. So completely new character and all these things. And because of that, basically that's saying, here's Horizon. If you want to play the original, you can play the original, but this one doesn't change the original in any way, shape, or form. It only adds to it because it doesn't change it. It only adds to it because it expands the world. So it's showing you a bigger picture of what's happening here. And the new show is exactly that. It goes back into the past where we know in general what happens, right? There is the lore in the game of, basically the fall of man, the apocalypse. How does it occur? What goes down? And we do get little snippets of personal stories. Occasionally you'll get the audio files from people, or, you can get the emails as you're going around scanning in the world. In the new one, they have the black boxes that you can collect, and then you can hear some of these soldiers talking to each other, so you can get snippets of it. But in general, there's no one narrative that's kind of carried throughout. And because of that, you can go back, you can create entirely new characters that don't exist in the games at all, but still could possibly exist in the world, because obviously we don't have, you know, how do you say it? We don't have backgrounds on every single human who lived 1,000 years ago. So, you can add something in and then expand the world, and it will add to the world, especially if you get something where, they take the show, they expand some of the lore. They take the lore that's already there, they don't change any of it, but they expand it, they add some characters and stuff like that. Maybe they add an event, right? A certain battle or something that was not mentioned in the games. If the games comes back and mentions something that we see in the show again, and they kind of, they have some sort of cohesion, people love that. Yeah, I'm sure there are people that hate it, but I've never met one. So, things like that can really bring the two fan bases together, because the show references the games, or not necessarily the show references the games because this is a prequel, but the show has things that the games will reference. Okay, and that the game already exists. The show references things, or the show is a reference to things in the game. And so people who watch the show can talk about the show. People who play the games can talk about the games, and nobody's stepping on each other's toes. Everything meshes. And when somebody a fan of the show mentions maybe something offhand, somebody from the game is like, "Oh, I read something about that in the game," and that starts a conversation. Okay, it starts a conversation because, oh, we can expand on this, as opposed to something like Halo, which starts an argument because you have, this is what happens, and the other person says, no, this is what happens. So the difference is starting a conversation versus starting an argument. And I think that's where reboots and remakes and these sort of things succeed, is when they start conversations, not start arguments. And a lot of times, though, they do end up starting arguments. I think that's kind of the fatal flaw a lot of the time in these kind of adaptations and whatnot. So it can be done right, in my opinion. I really would like to hear some other people's opinions on this. I would really love to have some people, call in or whatever, and talk about it. What do they think? But currently, it's just me right now, so I'm just kind of ranting. So you're getting a one-sided argument over here right now. So, but yeah, that's kind of what my overall concept of it is that, if you can add to the story, we can have conversations, and nobody is stepping on anybody's toes. And so nobody's getting offended by it, which means everybody's having a good time, right? We're all having fun together. But if you do start getting into, changing things, then one person says this is what happens, one person says that's what happens, and they argue, they fight, and then you get these really toxic fan bases that we can sometimes see. So yeah, and I do think that there's, humans are flawed. We're not perfect. I think there does need to be, on some level, not just I would say people, but myself is included in this, of accepting things that are new. A lot of times, people are right. The original does exist, and it doesn't necessarily change the fact that the original does exist. And these are, these are fictional things. They're not true stories or something like that. So, getting offended over it is a little bit silly. But again, to what I was saying before, to us, this is something that's very important to us. This is a part of our culture, you know, our gaming culture or our book culture or our movie culture or whatever. This is part of, you know, our culture, not as, you know, as a country, but as a group of fans, right? Uh, and because of that, you know, I think sometimes people need to be a little more understanding that, like, oh yeah, this is kind of, yeah, you are kind of justified in your offense. You're being offended. And I think if people came out and said that a little bit more, like, no, you're right, yeah, they did change it, and um, that wasn't good. But you know, the new story is good, and I think that's for me why I prefer, you know, something to be inspired by rather than based on, right? Because if it's inspired by, you can follow the same stories. I think a good example of this would be Watchmen, not the movie necessarily, but the comic. Because when Watchmen first came out, I don't remember the name of the writers. I should know, but I don't. But when it first came out, they wanted to use original DC characters. I think Owlman was supposed to be Blue Beetle, if I remember correctly. Dr. Manhattan was supposed to be the Atom, I believe. So these characters were very much, was it Rorschach was supposed to be, what's his name, the Enigma, I'm not sure, but these characters were supposed to be actual DC characters, and that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to take actual DC characters and put them in this more realistic setting, quote unquote, where, you know, it's darker, it's grittier, it's reflects, you know, the darkness or subtle nuances of real life a little more accurately. And so that's what they wanted to do. And DC was like, no, you are not doing that. You are not putting this character in this situation, right? We're not going to put Blue Beetle in a ship, you know, with a girl after a big bar fight and they're going to get it on. That's no, you're not doing that with our characters because they have an image. They have their canon, right? They have their ideas, their philosophies, these sort of things. And we don't, you know, that's sacred on a certain level. And we don't want you messing with that. So what did they do? They said, okay, you can still make the comic. You just can't use the original characters. You have to create your own characters. So what do? They create characters that are analogies to the other characters. Owlman is, what's the difference between, say, Owlman and Blue Beetle? Not really too much of a difference, right? What's the difference between Dr. Manhattan and the Atom? There are subtle differences, but, you know, overall, for what they represent to the story and what they can do, slight differences, but, you know, very similar on a lot of levels. And so because they do that, they create not only the story that they want to create, but they don't step on anybody's toes for doing it. They don't take away the canon of the original, you know, so the original does still exist and there isn't something else to replace it. You know, that's kind of the ideas of these remakes is like, yes, the original exists, but yes, you also tried to replace it. Nobody tried to replace the original characters. And also, I think personally, I think it's better because you can take these original characters, but you can take them in new directions because you're not, they don't come with baggage. It's a new character that's an archetype of the same original character, but you can take it in new and interesting directions, right? So here's an example of where I think I went very, very wrong. So in the Man of Steel movie, Superman at the end is fighting Zod, and you know, spoilers, but this movie's how old? So you know, come on, guys, get on board. And he's fighting Zod, and one of the defining traits of Superman is he does not kill. That is one of his defining traits, right? That's who Superman is. And at the end, he's fighting Zod, and Zod basically says, "I'm not going to stop." And you know, he starts shooting out laser eyes. He's going to kill people. And basically, he gives Superman an ultimatum. He's like, if you don't kill me, I am never going to stop. Because I am so full of hate for you and this world. And I want to bring back my world. And I don't care about this world at all. That I will never stop until I get what I want. The only way to stop me is to make sure that I can never fight again, i.e., you need to kill me. And so that's basically what it comes down to, is Superman has to make a choice. If he doesn't kill Zod, Zod's going to kill all these people. Or he kills Zod. It's the trolley. It's the trolley enigma, right? If he, right now Zod's going to kill people, but he can switch the switch, save the 5 people, but he kills 1. And he's responsible for that, and had he not done anything, would he be responsible for those deaths? Because he didn't do anything, right? So it is the trolley problem. And he ends up killing Zod. He ends up making that choice. And it messes him up, right? And personally, I thought that was great. I thought that was fantastic. Because I was like, yeah, this is real life. It's not always so simple. You can't always choose the good. There's not always a good answer, right? Sometimes you have to make sacrifices for the least worst answer. I won't even say the best answer, the least worst answer, the least bad. And I thought it was great. I loved it. Krian hated it, absolutely hated it. And the reason he hated it is because he's a big fan of kind of the older comics, and he believes that comics should be uplifting and positive, and that these characters should represent positive things. Superman, he's a character, but he's also in a way an ideal. The idea that we can solve our problems without, he still uses violence, but he doesn't kill people. So it's this idea that there's always another way, a better way to solve our problems, and he represents that. And when you put him in this situation where he must choose, it basically says this ideal is a lie. It doesn't exist. And and because Superman is supposed to represent this ideal, then he needs to, so basically we're saying this ideal is a lie. And so for Krian, he hated it. He was like, no, this is not Superman. This is not a Superman story at all. It ruins Superman to do this. It ruins the entire point. That's not what it exists for. And, when it first came out, I argued with him. I was like, no, this is great. It makes him make the choice. And this is really interesting and nuanced and things like that. But the more as I've thought about it, I'll admit, I think Krian was right. I think I was wrong. And because they could have done the Watchmen thing, you could easily create a new character and establish it as their, part of their character, that they have a set of rules. They don't kill, right? Superman's not the only one that does that. That's supposedly a Batman thing as well, although Batman has actually killed people and has used guns in the comics in the past, particularly in the very early comics. So, but anyway, with, you could do the Watchmen thing. You could create an entirely new thing. Isn't that what that movie Brightburn is basically? What would happen if Superman was evil? If he didn't have that, if he didn't have a conscience for whatever reason, right? He just his power corrupted him at a very young age. So, and that's an interesting take on it. But they didn't name it Superman. Everyone knows it's Superman. Everyone knows what it's supposed to be. But they didn't name it Superman, so it doesn't step on Superman's toes. It's one thing where we're like, okay, we know what this is an analogy to, but it doesn't harm the source material in any way, shape, or form, because it isn't the source material. It's inspired by the source material. It's not based on the source material, right? And in Man of Steel, you could have told that story that way. And now that I think about it, I'm like, yeah, you know what? It didn't have to be in a Superman movie. You could have made a movie with an entirely original character, or made a comic book or something with an entirely original character and had that exact same plot. And then you could have experimented with things with that aren't in Superman, right? If you do that, you don't need a Lois Lane. Or you could try something new, right? You could you could change his job. He doesn't have to be a reporter anymore. He doesn't have to have fallen in Kansas. You don't need certain characters like Lois Lane or Jimmy, right? you can change those. You could change the character fundamentally. You could make this superhero gay or something like that. And it's not going to step on the toes of Superman, right? Because it's an entirely new person. But you can still tell that same story. And so I think in a lot of ways, that is the better approach to remakes or reboots. Ways that basically you can keep the canon intact, right? And you can create new canon that allows you to explore things that you really couldn't have explored before. I know in comic books they do have Ultraman, who is the evil Superman, right? And that's because in comic books, like I said before, we're used to this idea of a multiverse. So there are, evil Superman. There's Ultraman. I think it's Ultraman. Is that right? It's Ultraman. And then there's also, was it Injustice, where Superman goes crazy and evil, right? So they have those lines. Comic books, I think, are kind of an exception to the rule because you can do that. But I'm pretty sure Korean probably hated Injustice too as well. But yeah, so you definitely have options in these sort of things. So I think if you can manage to expand canon in the way that Final Fantasy Remake did as a sequel, ignoring this whole Threads of Fate and Arbiters of Fate thing, which is cheesy and it didn't really work out too well anyway. But changing some things up, expanding beyond, because it's a sequel. It's cheap. It's a cheap move. You're just doing it for financial gain at that point, where you're like, I want to make my own story, but I want to make sure that everyone's on board. So I'm going to tell them it's the original thing, and they're going to come back. And then once they're already in, I'm going to be like, nope, I'm doing it my way, but you've already paid. So I think that was a bit disingenuous. But expanding it like that, doing things like adding the Jesse chapter into Final Fantasy VII Remake, adding some of the gaps, fleshing out characters that maybe had not been fleshed out before, because you're not changing any of the canon, you're just adding to it. You're not changing already established things, you're just establishing new things that fit with the old things. So, something like that, I'm perfectly cool with. Or doing the Watchmen thing and saying, let's take some of these original characters, but change some of the names, change, some of the locations, change some of their situations, so that, everybody can see who it's supposed to be, but it's not that person. And we can change things a little bit up, change things up a little bit, right? You can make somebody like Rorschach a little more violent in his methodology, because it's not the original character. And you're not changing his personality because it's not him. It's an entirely new person. So they just fill a similar role. So I think in a lot of ways, that's my preferred way to do it. But yeah, I think the overall, the point is that people get offended when you change things in the things that they love. And we get really defensive about it, and maybe we should be a little bit less defensive about it. But on the other side, you have these people who get really offensive about it, with, oh, hey, just go back and play the original. I think, it's that's yeah, I think that's an offensive thing. You're offending them because this is something that's very important to them, and you're trivializing it, and you're telling them that this is trivial, and get over yourself. But this is something that's very important to them. It is part of their culture. So I think that's kind of what I wanted to get at, and that's me expressing my opinion. And if I'm being entirely honest, I'm actually very disappointed, because I was really hoping that we could get some other people on here to discuss it, because I would really love to see some other points of view. Like I said, I had my opinion about Man of Steel, and I thought it was great. And Korean hated it, and we talked about it, and I completely thought he was wrong for a long time. But the more I think about it, and the more I've thought about like how this has affected me in other ways, I think that he was in the right, and I think that I was in the wrong. So I did change my mind, and I would have loved to see other people's views on this, to get the ideas of what they think, and maybe my mind will change again, right? Maybe you can change my mind back, or maybe there's a third option that I'm not even seeing here, that that somebody else could have introduced me to. So I'm a little disappointed that I didn't get any feedback today. But overall, I think I've expressed everything that I wanted to express. I think I rambled on a couple times and repeated myself just to fill up time. But overall, I've pretty much said everything I wanted to say. And hopefully, if you guys are listening to this as a podcast or watching this video later, then please leave some comments somewhere because I would love to see what other people think on this. And, I would love to see if people think I'm wrong. Admittedly, I would love to see people who think I'm right. Nobody hates it when people come out and say you're right. So I would love to see people say that as well. And I would love to see people expressing their opinions and, not arguing, right? We don't want to argue. We don't want to do the Halo thing. But we want to have discussions, right? So I would love to have some people throw out some other ideas and say, well, what about this? Have you considered this? And then maybe we could, have a debate or a discussion. Maybe discussion's a little bit less competitive than a debate. So I would love to have that. And yeah, leave comments if you guys are interested in having an expansion on this. I've said what I wanted to say. But yeah, if we can get enough people together, then I would be more than happy to listen to what other people have to say. So anyway, that is it for today. Thanks for coming. And I hope to see you all again soon. So